Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Beyond Dimensional. We are your hosts. I'm Liz.
I'm Lori.
There we are. And we are back for a fantastic talk with someone that we've heard from before, but we were just so enthralled the first time that we had to have her back on. Her name is Melissa Kim Corter. She is an expert in all things shadow work, deep psychology, unraveling and unpicking the depths of our psyches. But today, we're not talking about our psyches. We are talking about serial killer psyches, and we are so stoked for it. I am here for it. I swear this was like something that Lori and I have been talking about wanting to get into. I will let Lori jump in, and I know she's got a list. So, Melissa, welcome back.
Thank you.
I
I'm
actually have the
really
list. It's usually Liz that has the list. So listen, this is not a typical episode for us because we're going to get into a little true crime, which, there's nothing more fun and interesting than true crime as far as I'm concerned, outside of, all the other stuff we talk about. But Melissa, you have experience from a psychological perspective studying serial killers and the people associated with the serial killer mind. You're the master psychologist, not me. I want to talk a little bit about some of your experiences, what you know, and get your perspective on good versus evil. We talk to a lot of people in kind of the mystical realm, the mystical world, and I hear a lot about there's no good and there's no evil. I can't wrap my brain around no good and no evil when there are people like, Ted Bundy that has existed in the world, Jack the Ripper, et cetera, et cetera. So tell us about what you know about whomever you want to share, and we'll dig right into that.
Yeah, so it might help to just give a little context if that's okay. I might just kind of go back to like some of the ways this came about, my interest in this, because it involves some of these types of individuals. That when I was a kid, I was a weird kid, and I think we talked about some of that in the in the last interview. But I would dig in the woods and play games, looking for things and playing detective. And there's this crazy situation that unfolded where we actually had a family member. Well, let me go back. So my mother sat me down one day and she was like, "Listen, you're starting to hang out with the wrong people. You're getting mixed up in the wrong things." And she was really worried about me. I was starting to like sneak out and go explore the world in the middle of the night. And I was a really wild, crazy teenager. And she was trying to keep me safe and protected and sort of contain some of that. And so
Sure.
she sits me down one day and she's like, I just got to tell you this story. And she tells me how there was a serial killer in the area and how some of the bodies and body parts had been found scattered throughout the woods, which were on one side of the home that I grew up in. And this road, this one particular road with all these woods, it was like 30 miles long and it connected one part of New Jersey with New York State. And so it's that stretch of road where there's all these haunting stories and ghost stories, but there's some real, actual terrible things that happen. And so she's telling me this, and I'm thinking, instead of this scaring me, I'm like becoming more curious. I'm like, of course, I felt horrible on one hand. I'm a deep feeler, I'm highly intuitive, empathic. I felt so much for the idea that someone's life was harmed and all of that. And simultaneously, this curiosity of like, why would someone do that? What leads someone to do that? Like that, it just, my mind couldn't wrap itself around it. So I started to have a lot of experiences like that of just very difficult encounters with death, with murder, with tragedy. So many of them throughout my life. I started just paying attention and trying to understand, is there a pattern here? Why me? Why am I getting so close to these horrific things? And I actually got in trouble too for bringing an article to school when I was in grade school because there was an article about a leg that was found in the water. And I brought it to school for show and tell, thinking, oh, so interesting. And I had no idea. Like, I'm like, why is everybody so upset? My mom's like, we got a call from the teacher. You're not going to do this again. Bring this thing in. The weirdest thing about this stuff is that for years I tried to research, like I assumed that that article had to do with the body parts, the body parts, the remains that were left from the other story that my mother had told me about, which was attributed to a man called the Iceman. So he was a serial killer that was connected to the mob. He was convicted of 5 murders, but responsible for over 200 in New York City and surrounding areas. So
Nice.
some of the body parts were from his victims. I always thought that the article that I had gotten in trouble for must have been that, right? Like, what else could it be? And so I researched, tried to find it, couldn't find it for years, been trying to find it. Well, about 3 months ago, I had an interesting conversation with a relative who used to be a detective and was very active in the same area at the same time that all these weird things were happening, body parts being found. And it turned out that he was a detective on a different case of a different serial killer in the area. That serial killer, his name was Joel Rifkin. And he had killed a bunch of different women and these really just horrific stuff.
Awesome.
But it's interesting because when this relative was talking about his role in finding the body and, being a detective, all of a sudden my radar went off and I went, gosh, that's the article. That is the article that I got in trouble. So these random pieces throughout my life, it's always been this way. Where as much as I didn't want to necessarily go into this field to look at this kind of material, to work with these types of things, the interest was always there. And I always have been pulled into it. So I just started, instead of fighting it, I'm like, what can I do to be of service or help and bring some type of light into this dark territory? So all of it really began with those very intense, bizarre sort of circumstances.
Oh.
You asked me about evil and some, the different perspectives around that. I'm someone who definitely knows enough to say I really probably don't know much of anything, and there's always so much more to what we think to be true about something. So I'll
Sure.
kind of start with that and say I have a perspective and I'll share it, but of course it's not the end all be all. And to be honest, I don't know. What I do know is what I've seen through my perspective, and something I've noticed and studied has to do with the notion of evil. And if you ask different people what that is, you tend to get some common ground, but it still varies in what it is. For example, just to take it out of the realm of the serial killer and true crime for a moment, I'm also deeply embedded in spiritual communities, personal development communities. And
Yeah.
if you ask people from those different areas what it is, there might be a religious or spiritual overtone to it. There might be, a view of what evil is depending on the filter we're seeing things with. Yet in the personal development and spiritual communities, they also tend to believe and resonate with things like intuition and having spiritual gifts.
Yeah.
Yet you can take those things and bring it in another context to a different industry or different perspective, and some of those things are seen as evil or devil's work. So I like to kind of bring that up because I feel like a lot of the topic around evil or conversation of evil has so much to do with the fears we're projecting onto the canvas we're talking about. That's why I think it changes. Now, that's not to say there aren't some things that have crossed my path and maybe some of yours that are just unfathomable and difficult to wrap our minds around. And it's natural that when we come in contact with content, material, experiences that are so intense and we can't make anything of it, it is almost a default to go to, that's evil, because I don't even have a way to explain it, to express it, to understand it, to even relate to it. So I think that's important because what I've learned in studying these humans, they're still people. Certainly don't condone their actions. I don't stand behind them and say, well, they've been traumatized or this or that. A lot of times that's true, but not in a way that it's being dismissive to the victims or the people that have been have been harmed from their actions. And they are people, though. And we have this issue. And I say we in a general sense, knowing not everybody fits into that. But let's talk about maybe boiling it down to like the Western society. It's a little bit easier to give it some context with. A lot of us in the Western world want clarity on things. We want to be able to put something in a box, label it, and say it's this. That gives us a sense of safety. It gives us the ability to say, that is bad, I am good. Or that person is evil, but I have morals. I have empathy. I have all the qualities, the things that some of these people have been deemed not to have. The problem with that, though, is we're making assumptions based on a snapshot. And that snapshot is often what we see with a crime that's been committed or horrific act. We're seeing a part of the lens of behavior that that person has um, enacted, right? We're not seeing the full picture of that person. What led up to that moment? What was there a stressor, a trigger, which there usually is for these types of behaviors? And so if we just focus on the act, it's so much easier to build a case for evil around that. But what I've also seen is studying some of these individuals, especially the Iceman in particular, because I really went on a deep dive with that one because it was so close to home, literally, so personal in my life. And I just, there's something about research to me that's comforting. It's like a weird paradox. It's like terrible information, but if I know what I know, I feel safer somehow in researching it. And I just think it's one of my weird gifts to do that. So I
I
studied him.
totally feel that. I totally am the same. Yes.
It's facts. It helps
Awesome.
with the understanding from a factual, not just a intuitive perspective.
Right. And I feel like too, it can sometimes validate those intuitive feelings. It can really bring it in. So yeah, I studied him for quite some time and I was absolutely horrified by his childhood experiences. The level of death and murder and torture and things that surrounded his childhood. And it was easier for me as a human looking at another human and then in my own mind saying, here's the facts. No wonder this person ended up this way. I think the topic of evil gets a little bit more difficult to discern and understand or even be with in conversation when we don't have all those pieces, when we just see something that terrifies us, when something leaves us unsettled and we don't know what to do with it. It's so easy to then project evil onto that thing. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I think that my work for myself and others that tend to resonate with it, it slows down that process of projecting onto the canvas and assuming that this thing, this person, this action is evil. And we start to see through the layers and look a little closer. And we start to see different patterns of behavior. There's symbolic things that are intertwined in these experiences. And I know it's not for everyone to look at because this type of content can be very triggering and activating. But I think it's a gift for those that choose to do it and can do it with compassion because we tend to be the ones to bring things to the surface. That's part of shadow work, right? Bringing things to light. So if we can see these horrible things and somehow not even justify or make sense of them, but bring in new pieces of potential understanding, it starts to close the gap on what we might have considered as something as evil and all of a sudden go, maybe there's just a lack of knowledge, information, or something else. And I think it's hard for us to justify that type of behavior without having that word as a part of it. It's horrific, to be honest, it just is. It's horrific. There's no way around it. And it's still a very human part of the psyche. It's not one that thankfully is activated often in the majority of us, but the majority of us don't have that fragile of an ego where we're not at the whim of this, the deeper impulses within us. So there is a case for that too, to say, is something evil or is this maybe a myth that's being played out from within the psyche? So I start asking questions, and that's one of my ways of trying to lean in a little bit to get closer to see in a way that feels like there's some healthy psychological distance to the subject matter.
5 questions. Is it like saying the act is evil, the person is not?
I think that's a way to say it for sure. And I think that fits, in a lot of these different scenarios. I would tend to say that's certainly a piece of it. I think the thing that is difficult when it comes to that is also thinking about, we're talking about things that have happened to people where we have the distancing from it. I wouldn't know how to answer that if it were my child, my spouse, my sibling. And I think in that way, it's helpful to see why there's more charge or emotion and the just going to evil as the answer, because it's just so much to try to understand. But when we have any level of emotional intensity to something, I think it makes it more difficult to sift through these layers. And let's just be honest, right? Our emotions, our feelings, our reactions, if someone causes us harm, our first instinct might not be, I wonder why they did that. Our first instinct might be, you took something away from me, or you ruined my life or impacted my life. And which is a healthy reaction to have a response to some type of violation on any level. And when we have people involved that are a little bit more distant from the wound, from the experience, you can see things differently. You don't have the emotion there that's clouding those decisions or being able to connect those patterns. But yeah, I would say I do align with the idea that actions can be evil. Especially, I maybe wouldn't use that language myself, but I'm not saying it resonates, right? There's something there that resonates. And I would also look at the context personally as I'm engaging with things to see, like, what is the emotional charge here? Is it the event in general that has happened? Is it a certain dynamic between people? Why did this one person respond this way? And that's the thing I think we're really afraid to do, many of us, when it comes to these figures throughout history. These, people are called monsters, serial killers. Like, they're often thrown in that same category, evil monsters. What's interesting, though, about this is if you actually go back in history and you look at what a monster is, and you'll see this in early film and media, monsters were these creatures that were sent to warn the people that something was out of balance. So I find that kind of interesting also. I'm not saying that serial killers are doing us some justice or duty. That's not at all what I'm saying, because, sometimes people take things out of context. But it's a way of sort of like all of a sudden getting closer to the language we use and becoming curious about what, why, how. Why is my thought that this thing is evil? Doesn't mean right or wrong, just curiosity. And curiosity is really difficult when we have strong beliefs about something. So when evil comes up, the topic of it, that's one of the things I notice most is there are a lot of often strong beliefs around it, which can make it difficult to talk about.
I think I'm pretty kind, but not enough to be able to reconcile people like serial killers torturing babies or chopping people up or whatever as not evil. And maybe that's not the correct word. There's a better word, but I don't know. That's hard for me. I understand from a psychological perspective what you're saying. I also think that, there's many of us that have had horrific childhoods, but I'm
Right.
not murdering anyone or torturing them.
Right.
However, you made me think of is a conversation I had with my brother this weekend. And we were talking about if someone ever harmed my niece. So she's 7. We talk about all the predators that are around now and how, my daughter's 25. It's been a long time since I've had to, inspect every person in the neighborhood, or in the grocery store. And even now it's more forensically inspecting, right? I'm looking at everything. I'm terrified. And we all say, and I firmly believe this, that if someone hurt my niece, I could murder them.
Right.
I would absolutely, if given the opportunity, be able to take that person's life should they harm my niece in a way like a sexual thing and an abusive, torturous, like I could become, I'm not going to be a serial killer. I'm not
Right.
going to, make this a habit, and it would have to be extreme, but that would trigger something in me for sure based on my own past and history that could make me go to that place. Does that make sense? Is that
Absolutely.
kind of what you're saying is like, it's just it's a different level, but some people don't have, I don't know, is it the innate response to just be a killer? That's not the way that they behave, or it's just a different type of trigger based on different, DNA, or I don't know what I'm trying to say, but like different brain.
Yeah. The way that your brain
chemistry.
functions, the way
Yeah.
that you process
Yeah.
stimuli, the understanding of your world and perspective, and then like whoever raised you, I guess, in certain ways. And then the challenge becomes, as you both were talking, I was thinking about this, and I know Lori and I have talked about this a lot, where if you're going into the beyond dimensional realm, right, then you're
Yeah.
thinking of, okay, well, thinking about a soul having chosen a body. If you're talking about karma and past lives and intention on the earth at this time in this body and this understanding. And I don't know if you have this understanding, Melissa, but like I'm sure you have it, but like, I don't know if you dive into that on that kind of level with serial killers and all that, but you start to think through the whys and you try to reconcile it in your mind of like, okay, well, I could kill somebody maybe easily. I'm just gonna say it, maybe easily if they really, like Lori's saying, if they found that trigger, then that animalistic part of your human nature, like we are animals at the end of the day. Like, and to your point, like generations ago, centuries ago, millennia ago, killing and killing very systematically a lot was part of our everyday occurrence. Like it was very normal. And people understood that death was a punishment or death was a part of a greater story of what it was, like sacrifices, Spanish Inquisition. Like there were so many different ways that we used murder. And nowadays, like serial killers are now seen like conquistadors and other kings could have been serial killers, right? But it's just a different context. So it's all so intertwined and fascinating. I'm sorry, I didn't really. There was no question in that. I was really just
So
on
good.
a soapbox.
Part of the question is like from a karma perspective, what's your thought on that? Because this is one of the things I have the hardest. This is why I can't reconcile karma completely. I believe in it. I understand it, but I don't know why anyone chooses to come back as Ted Bundy. Like,
Right.
I don't
Or
understand.
someone who's murdered by Ted Bundy.
Sure, fair enough. Yeah, tortured by them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same. I don't think there's an answer. I don't think there's one answer for any of these questions. I think what it comes down to, for me is perspective.
Yeah, sure.
It's like, even when we think about, you're seeing, a great point that comes up a lot is like, we've all had trauma or different degrees of it or
Yeah,
impactful moments.
1000%.
And we don't all necessarily, though, have an extremely fragile ego. And that's essential, really big piece. And we don't necessarily all have traumatic brain injury or different. So you start to get these layers. It's kind of like if we were to flip it into positive, well, how come there's like Michelangelo or these greats in history, the artists and these individuals, Einstein, all of these people, these notable figures who stand out for their brilliance and their excellence. It's kind of like inverted in a weird way, right? It's like they just built on the skills and the gifts and the talents and they were able to excel in these interesting ways. And that it's almost like the complete opposite with the serial killer. It's like they are so in darkness, so devoid of feeling, of empathy, of creativity, of all these things that we would think like, that as humans that we tap into on a regular basis. But the fragility of the ego is a really big piece of this. And the reason that's so important, I think, is because a lot of us don't understand just the basics of how the psyche works. And if we kind of just understand the basic layer of, the psyche is Greek for soul, and we have this part of us that is operating that involves these layers of consciousness and layers of perception. And the fastest way to say this is all of us have a persona, the skin, the outer part of us that faces the world. We all see it's what we look like. It's how we show up and demonstrate with clothing, with facial expressions. Like we're meeting each other with our personas, the mask we wear to the world. And these types of individuals that often commit these kind of crimes can excel at morphing that persona to exploit other people. So they can use it to convince, to be able to get people to do whatever it is that they want to do. And so it's like, well, why would someone take that kind of energy and not create something amazing with that type of power, like the Michelangelos and whatever, but instead use it as a destructive force? And I do believe that this comes down to the idea of the psyche being having the shadow territory that we all are connected to, the collective unconscious. There are patterns of behavior that are demonstrated. There are these things called complexes that exist beneath the surface of awareness. We know we have one because if we're triggered by something, we feel it. And it's sometimes even surprising to us. We'll be in the middle of something and, have a conversation with someone and all of a sudden you're like, why am I reacting like this? Why am I so upset over what this person is saying? But if you have a healthy ego, which is like the gatekeeper between all these different layers, that healthy ego can take some criticism. The healthy ego can have someone, even let's say in traffic, right? Or somebody cuts you off. If you have a healthy ego, you might give that person the finger. You might mumble a little something, roll your eyes, or just let them go. If you have a fragile ego, your sense of self is diminished. Your personal identity might feel really small and be actually at the whim of other types of compulsions and things like that. That type of person, it's the difference between the one that lets somebody go and the one that gets out of the car and needs to go chase the person, hunt them down. They become fixated. They're driven by a behavior, a compulsion. So it's very difficult to say, like, well, let's just not act that way. It's similar to telling an addict that they should just give up the substance, give up the behavior. There's compulsions at play here. And when we don't have a compulsion, it's really hard for us to understand what that can feel like, to be overcome by it, which kind of leads into one of the things you mentioned earlier, or it might have been before we even hopped on here, about the idea of possession. We can think of possession falling into this category of someone under the grip of a compulsion. Maybe not necessarily, and I'm not, saying I'm closed off to theories around other entities and energies and stuff like that. And at the same time, I've also experienced things where there's a compulsion that someone's possessed by. It's like if you have a brilliant idea and it won't let you go, you have no choice. You've got to write that book or do that thing, right? Or whatever. But there's also negative compulsions where you don't know why, but you want to cause harm. You don't know why, but you want to pick up the bottle or take that substance. Or there's always the next level, though, of what's behind that and what's behind that and what's behind that. And what I found is a lot of us, when we say evil or possessed, I want to be very mindful to say not every time, and just in my experience, it's usually somewhere in this process we've stopped saying what's behind that because we've gotten scared, we've gotten repulsed, we've gotten angry, which are all healthy reactions. But we need people who can have their emotions in check to keep looking closer to go, what else is behind that? What's behind that? Because that's where more of that information may possibly come through. We might start to realize that some of these things are happening because of this person unconsciously acting out a behavior that they happened to them in childhood. They murder and death. It's also helpful to I use a Jungian perspective when I kind of present this. It isn't that someone is, we all have weird, dark fantasies, not necessarily to the extremes, but we all have weird thoughts that pass by or intrusive thoughts where it's like, oh my gosh, where did that come from? What was that about?
Sure.
The difference, though, is when we have that fragile ego that is really diminished, doesn't have a sense of self, what happens is we can start to become someone who, when we have a fantasy, we need to literalize it instead of understand it symbolically. So someone trying to kill something off emotionally and psychologically may not have the ability or help or support or resources to understand that there's a part of me I hate. There's a part of me I don't like. There's a part of me that's active. And that part can feel like the whole self. So someone that might be operating from that perspective, and this may or may not resonate, and it's a little bit touchy, but you're having visions of causing harm, of doing this. What do you think that is, right? There might be an opportunity there to show them that something is out of balance. Because here's the other thing. If we really want to stick to this idea, which I tend to lean into and believe, that the psyche is self-regulating. If it's self-regulating, that means even our actions and our behaviors are trying to show us something's out of balance. This is where looking at the behaviors and taking away the emotion for just a moment, not to allow them to get away with things, not to say, we're not coddling terrible people or we're justifying it. But if we can separate the horrendous nature of what's happening and look clearly into the symbolic pattern, we might have an idea of what's really being reflected in the person's psyche. This is where it would be helpful to not say, oh, it's evil, and therefore I'm not going to look at this or I don't want to deal with this. We need some people, not all of them, but some people need to say, this is deeply disturbing and chaotic, and I wonder what else is there. because those are the ones that are going to help maybe connect some of these dots. But shadow work absolutely can be an avenue. I just feel like it would be really hard to get the person into treatment or into a space where they would be willing to be honest and vulnerable about these darker feelings. I think a lot of them, and they have to want to get help. That's another missing piece here. There's a lot of these individuals where I would say that empathy is, I don't want to say it's broken or missing completely, but there are spiritual concepts and ideas about psychopathy and how they don't have a soul and they're just operating in darkness and things like that. But they have to be willing to get help in order to even work with shadow.
And people who are in that bucket, and I don't know the numbers at all. I'm saying a lot of what I understand, are narcissistic, they're sociopathic, like they don't have the ability to sit down and go, wow, let me analyze my behavior and how it impacts others, because they don't give a shit. It's all about them and that's all they see and understand. So I'm curious also from a genetic perspective, right? We have these triggers in our childhood and these different things that happen that cause us to act out later in life, but there's also a genetic component, I believe. I'm curious about your perspective on that. And then the other is generational trauma. Like, how does that work? Could it play into, what happens in this life with somebody who has that compulsion to murder, kill, or hurt others? Could there also be a, genetic, generational thing that happens along with some differences in their DNA?
Absolutely. I think it would be very similar to like if someone said, this individual has cancer. What possibly led to this? Is it environmental? Is it nutrition? Is
Sure.
it, all these
Genetic.
different factors? Is it ancestral, familial, all of the layers? And I think it'd be a kind of a similar answer for this too, to say like, I'm not saying, your diet necessarily is going to make you go off the rails in this way,
Sure.
but I do think there are all of those factors that can contribute to that. And I think that's the difficulty we have with this type of subject matter is it'd be so much easier for all of us if it was like, they all look like this. They all sound like this. They all behave this way. We all want the checklist. I did too, even studying psychopaths and sociopaths. I wanted the checklist because there's this really famous checklist that was developed by Robert Hare. And it's incredible and it's still used today. And it's this checklist, the psychopathy checklist, where you can read all of these questions and sort of get an idea of whether or not someone is a psychopath. But the issue with that, like you said, narcissism. So a lot of psychopaths are highly narcissistic. Not all narcissists are psychopathic, but the other way around, that most psychopaths are often highly narcissistic. And sociopaths, they believe, are created, where psychopaths, they believe, are born that way. So there's just a little differentiation. Sociopaths, they believe, had more of that traumatic influence, maybe brain injury, things like that. There are some studies that show that brain scans also can detect some heightened, emotional states and different things in these behaviors that are common. But again, it's kind of like if you've ever gotten into astrology, right? You could look at someone's chart and you're going to have all these aspects and planets in a certain
Totally.
way. Yet that doesn't dictate that the behavior will have to be a certain outcome.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So interesting. So from people that you've studied, you said you studied, Iceman that was, close to you. Who else have you really studied and kind of learned from?
There's an interesting story. There's so many of them I've studied. Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy. And I did an episode on this recently because it kind of haunted me. So I thought maybe I'd share it here. It's an interesting concept. So there's this quote that I came across, and this is something interesting happens when I research. Any of you that do any kind of research or, pay attention to just pulling pieces of information, there's always like an intuitive process to this and very synchronistic. So you'll start to look at things and other things show up. Other pieces just start coming together. So I was researching for my dissertation, writing on psychopathy and these different individuals. And I put on a documentary. It was a documentary on Ted Bundy. And there's a woman that they interviewed she was the daughter of his longtime girlfriend. And I mean, 20 years or something like that, they were together. And the thing that stood out to me in this interview he would send letters from prison all the time. And her mother, who was in the relationship with him, thankfully, they were never harmed by him, which was surprising after so many interactions and so many years. They always wondered, why were we not harmed? And all these other innocent women were. And it was so fascinating because they got to a point in the story where they were saying how he was sending all these letters. And then one day, the last letter that he sent from death row, the daughter intercepts it and doesn't let the mother have the letter. So the mother doesn't know it exists. And the person interviewing her is like, why that last letter? You let all these other letters come through. Why that last one? And she says, my mother had this part of her that would respond to him in this bizarre way. She couldn't let him go. She couldn't get him out of her life. She was responding in this really strange way. And the daughter said, and I was tired of seeing him exploit that part of her. And I thought that was so powerful, that level of insight she had, analyzing these situations. The synchronistic, bizarre thing that was going on at the same time is I came across this quote, and I believe, forgive me if I'm wrong, I believe the quote is by someone named Kenneth Timon. And the quote was, we seek the teeth to match our wounds. Left me with this, oof, that's deep, that's profound. I'm hearing this interview. That quote is sitting on a piece of paper in front of me. And then this random intuition goes, oh my gosh, the piece of evidence that they had that convicted Ted Bundy was his bite, a bite that he left. There's these layers of her being the daughter, talking about the mother being exploited, destroying the letter so that, this piece of her. And I'm thinking, as someone that knows the psychology and the shadow work, I'm like, oh my gosh, she's got a part of her psyche that's responding to him energetically, emotionally. So the psychopaths and these narcissistic individuals, we have to remember they're highly intuitive also. They just don't use it in a sense of good the way those of us that are highly empathic would, which actually makes us easier targets for them, which is horrible to say, but it's true. And part of what I want to do is help us understand our vulnerabilities so that we can be safer and things like that. But that was just such a bizarre connection between the parts of her that were being exploited. It made me think of that quote, we have the teeth, the teeth that match our wounds, meaning that maybe there's already something there within us that is operating. And then when this person crosses our path in this intense way, maybe even violent, not victim shaming or saying it's their fault or that they've done anything wrong, but there might be something there that just makes that so like a groove that you fall into, right? And then I just thought it was so interesting, this quote, the teeth, and then the bite mark. And it just all popped into my mind. I'm like, there's so much more to these things. And I definitely don't want to glorify these individuals. I feel a little tormented, honestly, sometimes when I talk about them, because it isn't about giving them more power. I want to understand more of the victim perspective. I want to get more into understanding and having compassion. But I think it's helpful to see these layers, that it's just so dynamic. And so that was one that left me feel really strongly to bring it in, if it's all right. This is where the topic of suicide sometimes comes in, because there's in the psyche, through this Jungian perspective, I'm also not saying it's everybody's belief around this, the individual is dealing with this one oppositional part that feels like the whole, and they're trying to kill off that one part of the psyche. Misunderstanding that, misinterpreting that, we want to end the whole life of the self, if that makes sense. That's often can be seen behind, if we look behind these layers of these types of individuals. Now imagine you have that, but it's outward faced instead of internal. So it's interesting because a lot of the individuals who have, what is that called? Borderline personality disorder. A lot of people, I don't want to say a lot, I don't have the statistics, the numbers on this. Let's just say it's been compared that borderline personality disorder, they can have similar dark qualities to those that are serial killers. The difference is there's a higher percentage of women who have borderline personality disorder than men. And it seems like the men who outwardly project have more of that murderous, rageful, hateful sort of action. The women with the borderline, they turn it inward. They destroy themselves versus someone else. So there's a lot
Sounds about
here
right.
in all of this, right? It's so nuanced. It's like trying to say, why is this person a serial killer? It's not going to look like the next one or the next one. Just like, why is someone an addict? It's not going to look like a cookie cutter thing, although there's layers to look at and investigate for sure.
I love that you just compared, well, I don't know if you did it on purpose, but addiction and murder and these kind of like uncontrollable urges, these compulsions to possession. I think that's such an interesting way to think about it because if we are talking through, like um inherited emotional trauma, like familial traumas, right? And addiction, like it's in your DNA, it's hereditary, right? If you go back to the understanding of the scientific backing of energy, you are inheriting an energy. We're all made up of it, right? So you are inheriting something that it actually is possessing you. It's possessed your being, and it's so difficult to change that at the molecular level. I just find that like God, it's possession, which is really cool. But that made me think about immediately, like I was thinking suicide, and then you're like, let's talk about suicide. But I mean, in a dark way. I'm a dark. I got. Let's talk about it. It may be bright in this room, but I'm real dark. But
I love you anyway. It's okay.
I think that's why you love me a little bit, just a little bit. I was thinking about. Let me get my thoughts together here. Can this all be worked out in shadow work? Yes, there are things where you're talking about chemical breakdowns and different, we can talk about learning differences and like your understandings of emotional placements. Have you seen where had these people maybe had some intensive shadow work done? Is that could that have prevented some of this? Could that have as you said before, lit up their basement so that it wasn't the pinpointed ego that was in that room. It was more of that, like letting that light in.
That's such a good question. I have so many thoughts that are dropping in you were talking about that. Oh, there's so much. The first thing, so just to the point on the ego, it's so interesting because in a lot of these situations, we're dealing with power dynamics also. Predator prey, for lack of a better way of saying it. That's often how it's described, right? There's a power dynamic, and the ego, a fragile ego, is going to be one that wants power. And it's not humble power, it's egoic power, it's destructive power. So somebody who is more centered in their soulfulness, in their empathy, is going to recognize when the ego is at play, maybe becoming a bit inflated and needs to be knocked down a little bit. But someone else who has never felt powerful, has not been given attention, maybe been abused, it can be addictive. And there can be a chemical, you've got dopamine, all these things that are going on. It can be really addictive. All of a sudden, to have this glimpse chemically within the body, emotionally in the mind, and all of a sudden you have a seat of power, that is dangerous in certain circumstances. And it's really hard for some people to give it up. And this is one of the ways they are able to, obtain that. And but it's interesting to think about because again, it's the ego and the fragility of the ego. One of my favorite things, I also work in personal development. So with the shadow work, and I'll get to that in a second. There's a statement that's been coming to me and I've been sharing with my clients for about 2 solid weeks now. And there's usually a theme in my work that comes up for people. And the statement that came to me is that surrender is how the ego learns to receive. And it's interesting, right? If you think about that, it's like when I let go, but it takes vulnerability on some level, even if nothing is really happening, right? It's the perception within that we're being vulnerable. Surrender is how the ego learns to receive. It's also how it starts to widen its perspective on what it lets in, information that comes through. Imagine that light bulb beam we're talking about, that flashlight in someone that is in the middle of a psychotic episode or something. They are going to try to gain as much control as they possibly can. That window is so narrow. The focal point can maybe just be on the compulsion, right? There's all these layers to it all, but it's really important that we understand how to unpack some of that. And I would love to say that shadow work could be a wonderful avenue to explore. And it is for compulsions, for addictions, and for things like that. My concern is that people who experience the depth of some of these afflictions, I would call them, might not feel safe enough to go talk to someone. And that's scary. That's scary because I do think more people who are capable of absolutely horrendous things, if they had a way to communicate without being like, there's so much misinformation too about this legal system and how things work and mental health. And if they
Sure.
could be kept really confidential in that sense of course, you need to make sure that things are followed so people are safe. But if that individual was given the opportunity, I do think by looking at some of these things, if they have all this other stuff intact, right? If the brain itself is in a healthy condition and there's not like an injury or a tumor or something that's impacting these different centers of the brain that might cause them to react in a certain way, if they have all these other things kind of in check and it is just the compulsive unconscious part, absolutely working with shadow could be helpful and helping them understand that there's a part of them, that part of the compulsion might be that they feel they need to make the fantasy real. That's another big distinction between someone who has these inner thoughts and feelings and someone that acts on them. They literalize the fantasy. What's interesting about that is we do this a lot in Western society in other ways. We want to take certain texts, ideas, stories, situations, and literalize them. And we don't know how to look for the symbolic. If we can actually say to someone, what's going on in your psyche? You haunted in this interesting way and made me so curious to keep digging further and studying.
So I dated, well, it's one date, a serial killer that I later learned was a serial killer. And I just recently, I know, I just recently came to terms with all this. And it's part of one of these things in my life now where I am getting information about myself. Normally, every bit of information I get as a medium or intuitively or psychically is about everyone else. But there are times now where I am thinking about things or analyzing my behavior and my patterns. I'll get hey, remember the time when? And I'll get this information. I'll tell you the situation because it connects to part of what we're talking about in a couple ways. But one brief story, I was probably 30. It was a long time ago. Anyway, I was, single parent at 23. I'd really not dated and whatever. And it was one of the first times I ever tried one of those online dating things. And I met up with this guy and we met in this bowling alley parking lot. And he wanted to make me dinner. And I was smart enough to go, okay. And he said, well, get in the car. And I said, no, I want to drive my own car. I was like, no, I have a child in case I need to leave early. The daycare calls, sitter calls. I got to go. Okay, great. So we're driving out and we're literally in the boonies. Like it couldn't have been better written like a movie. Like
I was
it's
going to
out in
say,
the
Lori,
middle.
this sounds like the beginning of every serial killer movie.
None of this until recently really dawned on me. We walk into his house and it's completely sterile. There is nothing in this house. It was smelled of Clorox. It was exceptionally clean. There was plastic on furniture.
I'm getting
There was
like doctor
plastic.
vibe.
Yes.
So I
Wow.
walked in and I was like, immediate like, oh, this is not normal. I'm like, this is fucking weird. This is, do you have OCD? Ha ha ha. Like, what the fuck's happening? Right? And I made a joke like, well, where are you going to cook at? You don't have anything to cook with. Like, what's going on here? But it was a weird interaction. He became a different person when we got there. It was very, very robotic. There was a switch. Again, intuitively, I knew something was wrong. And at one point I looked down and I was like, oh my gosh, I have a bad feeling my daughter's not feeling well. And he's like, what? Did you get a call? And I said, well, my phone doesn't work out here. It did. But I said, because we're in the middle of nowhere, my phone doesn't work out here and I'm really worried and I have to go. And he looked at me and he goes, you have to go now? I said, yeah. And he goes, I don't know how I feel about that. I'm like, oh fuck. Okay, this is not good. I got up and I'm like, I'll make it up to you. I'm so sorry. I just mother's intuition. I got to get out of here. I get in my car. He let me go. I get in my car and I shit you not, I got a flat tire. And I am in the boonies and I had cell service, but who am I going to call? I'm not going to call this guy. I'm like trying to get out of here, right? I don't know how to fix a flat. I slept in that car overnight waiting for somebody else to come help me, praying that this guy would not show up because I just knew enough to know something was wrong. And it was until recently having, analyzing certain things and having this download of like, but do you remember when? And showing me what could have happened, what had happened right before I got there, the preparation that took place before I got there. And the reason he did not keep me or do me any harm is because I was a single mother. That was his thing. He either had a single mother, which I assume he did, but that was the only thing that saved me from him was this tiny bit of, I don't know if it's empathy, I don't know what it is for them, but this tiny bit of, oh, I have to let this one person go.
Well, and not to be dark, but it could have also been like, well, if she's got a kid, someone would be looking for her after this.
Right.
Like
It
you
could
had
be,
ties.
but my intuition tells me that that was the thing,
Yeah.
and maybe it was both. But he had something in his whatever that made him pause at the fact that I had a young child and I was a single parent. Now, does that make sense? Does my process of thinking that that's possible? I mean, do they sometimes have like that
Yes.
opposite trigger?
Yes, this is where we come back to remembering that these are humans. We never know what the thing is. Just like we don't know what might cause someone to always go off the rails, we can have certain assumptions, associations, patterns, statistics, all of that kind of stuff. But really, the psyche is quite intense, and we don't always know what the trigger is, what the flip, of the switch will be. So just like some of them will take action on a behavior because it reminds them of something, because it's similar to something, the stopping of an action, withdrawing from the behavior, cutting off the behavior can also happen just because they're sick or twisted, whatever, label we want to kind of give them, doesn't mean that there aren't parts of them that aren't also operating right in that way. So that makes sense that there could have been, and there's cases like that where they interview the people that got away. And they're like, what
Yeah.
happened? And sometimes they just took the opportunity to bolt. Sometimes it was the conversation. In fact, there's a new documentary that just came out, which I had popping in my head when you're talking about first being there in the bowling alley, and it's called Woman of the Hour. I don't know if you've seen that,
Just saw
but
it.
like,
So good. Just
it
saw it.
reminded me of what you were
Anna
saying, like
Kendrick.
parking lot and that whole thing. But the interesting thing about that, and I haven't researched this case. I heard about it years ago, but I really didn't dive into it. So I don't know how true this is, but how it was portrayed in the show is there's a conversation that happens between the victim and the perpetrator. And she convinces him that she just, through her conversation and what she's saying to him, he all of a sudden sees her differently, like almost as if she gets him, understands him, and he stops hurting her and takes her along for the ride. Ultimately, she finds a way to break free, to get the authorities and all of that kind of a thing involved. But it was a conversation that they had in that depiction. Again, I'll have to research to see if that's how it actually
It makes
happened.
sense. Yeah.
But that does happen, right? Where it's conversation unlocks something. There's symbols, that things that stand out. So even if they don't have empathy, they might have rules for their behavior. And this is where it gets a little interesting. Even if they don't have empathy to say, oh, she has a child, now all of a sudden I have a heart because I care for the child. They might have a rule about not hurting someone that has a child. Empathy doesn't even have to be the thing that's necessarily there. Not saying it wasn't, but it's so interesting to think about it's like logic based, often more so than it is about empathy.
Yeah.
Sense.
Totally.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense because they have rules on who they do kill.
Right.
So they likely,
Certain
I mean,
type.
yeah, exactly. Most of the time, some people are, and sometimes it's sporadic, but I'd say more often than not, and you correct me if I'm wrong, they do have a type, and they do have a pattern, and they do have rules that were almost like subconsciously created on what the scenario they're looking to create or the trauma they're looking to somehow highlight unbeknownst to them. So, and they don't kill more people than they do kill. So there's clearly rules on who they wouldn't kill. They just maybe don't even know.
Definitely makes me think of the thing with Ted Bundy and the daughter and the mom, right? Like, why did they live? Well, there was something there that he wanted to stay connected to. You know, maybe it gave him that fantasy world that he wasn't as bad as everyone thought, or I'm really not, quote, evil or whatever. But side note, I'm being reminded that also when I met that man in the parking lot and we started talking, he said, "You really look like somebody else I know."
Oh, interesting. Which could have been a favorable connection too, right? And maybe they had a daughter.
So I wonder I mean, I don't wonder because I'm glad you left, but I kind of wonder like what would have happened if you stayed.
I would have been chopped up
Chopped
in
up?
that plastic shit, as far as I'm concerned. Hopefully, never happening ever in anyone's life where you walk in somewhere and there's plastic laying around in the living room. You
Right.
know,
Yeah, no.
I didn't watch Dexter till many years after that happened, but that's just a thing where like, oh, that's not probably not good. This does not look favorable to me in any way. But,
Yeah.
you know, I was a little slow to respond. But I do remember also as I was trying to leave, I remember telling myself, act as normal as possible in the sense of like, don't act scared. Don't act like you figured it out. Don't
Yeah.
act like there's anything weird, which is what you reminded me in that movie, kind of what she did. It was like, you know, let's not tell anybody about this. I
Right.
would be embarrassed if anyone knew you did this to me. You know, from an intuitive perspective, Melissa, what is your take on, you know, good, evil, danger? Yeah, just randomly, what's your take?
Yeah. I think, when I think of good, when I think of evil, when I think of things like that, I don't really see the good and the evil as like these divided sides. I know there's oppositional energies and forces, but a lot of these things I see on a spectrum. I really do. I feel like psychopathy in itself falls on a spectrum, just like all of these other personality characteristics and disorders and things. There's a spectrum to it. There's an intensity on and an energy to all of it. And intuition is the key. I really feel like it's the key. Just following what our intuition is telling us, because it isn't going to match with what we see necessarily. I mean, you had this
Yeah.
hypervigilance, which was fantastic. Like you saw things off in the environment, but you also felt it in the body, and you had these
Yeah.
thoughts coming to you because it shows the layers of intuitive guidance that you receive. Somebody else that might not be as in tune with their information will still get it, and usually it'll land in the body in some way. It'll be like something feels off, right? All of a sudden feel sick. That's what we need to pay attention to if we're trying to gauge good and evil and things. I come back to really follow your instinct. Your instinct is going to tell you something's off. When they're charismatic and they're smiling and they've got you fooled, your instinct, you'll still know it, you'll feel it. The challenge is, will you listen to it when it doesn't make sense? Will you all of a sudden pause and go, everybody loves this person, or this seems like a great whatever, and back to the teeth that match our wounds. We want to become more and more conscious of our unmet needs. Because if we can be really honest with ourselves about our unmet needs and just kind of doing that type of work to figure out what they might be, where we're vulnerable, we'll also have that sense of where our vulnerability, not that we're going to be like, looking over our shoulder every day of our lives that there's going to be a murderer or serial killer. But as we're encountering a world that is ripe with more narcissism, things like that, it would suit us to really grow and build the skill of intuition, intuitive development, learning to trust that, and just knowing our unmet needs. You'll start to kind of sense all of a sudden, wow, this part of me is being fed by this situation here. And it could be something as simple as, I want to be liked. Well, are you going to be able to, like you did, right, Lori, break away from a situation, be like, oh my gosh, my daughter at home, I have to go. Somebody that's really grappling with people pleasing might not have the courage in that moment to do that. The unmet need, just like they have a compulsion, we also can have a compulsion at the same time in the opposite direction that can lead us to dangerous situations if we're not learning to cultivate intuition. So that's what I like to kind of really wrap up in all of this. If it's, making people feel like, oh my gosh, this world is so frightening. These things that exist and that happen, They're not here to make your life a living hell or to make it like everything around every corner is frightening. It's really just that reminder over and over again to come back to what is essential and true for you. Listen to your intuition. If there's any question, something's off, something's off. And that's all the information you need. Something's off. I don't know why, but it is. And just trust that. And then do what you can to listen, like you did, Lori, to get yourself out of the situation or the moment. Hopefully it's something less intense, but our intuition will still save us from making mistakes or going down the wrong road. So yeah, I would say everything exists on a spectrum, and through my eyes, to try not to label things as one way or the other, but to really use our intuition as a way of guiding and navigating that territory, to know what it is for us. Because what might be really wrong and not good for me might be better for one of you, or vice versa. And so I kind of like to think of things that way instead of, is it this or is it that? Because it could be yes and yes, depending on the situation. So
Absolutely. Wow, that's a perfect place to wrap us up. Thank you for leading us into that, Lori and Melissa. This was just delightful. I think this was really eye-opening in a lot of ways. You brought it full circle. Everyone, no matter who you are, start getting in tune with your body if you're not already. Listen when things are out of balance, right? We got to figure out if something just doesn't feel like it's normal, for starting to listen to that. If something doesn't feel right in a situation, listen to that gut. Pull a Lori, like make up a kid if you don't have one, like get the hell out of there. But it could be something really small, and I think you have to start where you are. Meet your intuition where it's at, and then continue to grow it. This was so wonderful to have you here again. And for anyone who did not listen to the first talk that we had with Melissa, you have to go back and listen. It is so informative. You will learn so much. So we just love having you. Thank you for being here. Real quick, where can people find you?
Sure. Thank you both. First of all, I love these conversations with you guys. It's so much fun. I love your questions, and the work that you do is so meaningful. So thank you for having me. And so you can find my work on my website. It's melissacorter.com. I have all sorts of programs and classes and blog posts and podcast episodes, and really like everything, the hub of everything is on my website.
Perfect. And we'll put
Amazing.
that in the show notes so people can link to you easily. Thank you so much, and we will talk soon.
Thank you.